The airport was crowded as usual. People rushed around, dragging their luggage, talking on phones, and checking the screens to see if their flights were on time. Among the crowd was an elderly man, quietly walking with the help of a cane. He moved slowly, careful with each step. His clothes were simple but clean. He looked tired, but there was a calmness in his eyes. He wasn't used to flying, especially not on long international trips like this one. But today was special. His son had gifted him this ticket, a business-class seat, for a flight to another country where his younger daughter lived. It had been years since he last saw her. The son, who worked hard as a mechanic, had saved for months to give his father this gift. He wanted his father to travel comfortably, to have space to stretch his legs, to rest properly, and to enjoy a little luxury. The elderly man didn't care much about comfort, but he accepted the gift with a smile, mainly because he knew how much effort his son had put into it. He had never flown in business class before. In fact, he had only flown a few times in his life. Airports and flights were still new to him. He arrived early, passed security slowly, and waited at the gate. When the boarding announcement came, he joined the line and slowly walked forward. He showed his boarding pass to the airline staff. The young woman at the gate looked at the ticket, hesitated for a second, then let him through with a forced smile. Maybe she assumed something was odd, but she didn't say anything. The elderly man didn't notice. He simply thanked her and moved forward. When he entered the plane, the flight attendants welcomed him. One of them, a tall woman with sharp features, gave him a brief look and a tight smile. She directed him to the business class cabin. The seats were large and soft with plenty of space. There were very few passengers in business class so far. Some were already sitting, reading newspapers or checking their phones. The man found his seat slowly and sat down with a sigh of relief. He carefully placed his small bag under the seat and held on to his cane. As more passengers began to board, a few of them looked at him with surprise. A well-dressed man in a suit gave him a long glance, then looked away, shaking his head slightly. A woman whispered something to her teenage daughter, who then turned to stare at the elderly man. Some passengers seemed curious, others annoyed. He didn't understand why. He just sat quietly, folding his hands in his lap, looking out of the window. One of the flight attendants walked past, then turned back and stopped beside him. She looked at his seat number, then at her list. Something wasn't matching. She leaned closer and asked, "Sir, can I see your boarding pass?" The elderly man pulled it out from his shirt pocket and handed it to her. She looked at it for a few seconds, frowned, and then asked him to wait. She walked away, speaking softly to another flight attendant near the curtain. They both looked at him, then back at the list. After a minute, the first flight attendant returned. She had a polite but firm expression. "Sir," she said, "I think there has been a mistake. This seat doesn't belong to you. Please come with me." The elderly man was confused. "But this is my seat," he said gently, showing her the ticket again. "My son booked it. He told me this was business class." The flight attendant shook her head. "I understand, but this seat has been double booked. We have to move you to economy." The man looked around, unsure. Passengers nearby were watching. He felt uncomfortable, but he didn't want to argue. He was a quiet man, used to keeping peace. Slowly he stood up, picked up his cane and his small bag, and followed the attendant. His back was slightly bent, his steps slow. As he passed the other passengers, some looked away, pretending to be busy. Others watched with quiet amusement. No one said a word. No one asked what was happening. No one offered help or asked if he was okay. The flight attendant led him past the curtain, through the premium economy section, and finally to the very back of the plane. She pointed to a narrow middle seat between two large men. The elderly man looked at the seat, sighed quietly, and sat down. His legs didn't have enough space. His cane didn't fit properly. The man on his left was already watching a movie and didn't even glance at him. The man on the right was fast asleep, headphones on. The elderly man placed his bag under the seat, kept his cane beside his leg, and leaned back carefully. The seat was stiff, nothing like the business class seat he had just left, but he didn't complain. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His heart felt heavy, not because of the seat, but because of the way he had been treated. He had done nothing wrong. He had a valid ticket. But still, he was removed. Maybe it was because of how he looked, old, modest, out of place. He didn't know for sure, but it hurt quietly, in a place that didn't show on his face. Far up in the front, the business class cabin returned to normal. Passengers stretched out, ordered drinks, and relaxed in their large seats. The seat that once belonged to the elderly man now sat empty for a while. No one seemed to question what had just happened. It was as if nothing had happened at all. The flight attendants went back to their routines. The curtain between business and economy was closed. The elderly man tried to get comfortable, but the space was too tight. His knees were aching, his back was stiff. He looked around and saw young people laughing, others watching movies, some already asleep. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't even press the call button. He just sat there, waiting for the flight to begin. Somewhere near the front, a young new flight attendant, still learning the job, had seen what happened. She had watched the old man being moved. Something about it didn't feel right. She had seen his ticket. She had seen the business class stamp. She wanted to ask questions, but the senior crew had told her to stay quiet. So, she said nothing. But her heart was not at ease. In the cockpit, the pilot was finishing some final checks. One of the crew members gave him a quick update about passengers and seating. He asked casually if everything was okay. The crew member mentioned a small seating change involving a double-booked seat. "Handled already," they said. But something about the situation felt strange to the pilot. He asked for the passenger list. As he scanned the names and seat numbers, he noticed the elderly man's name and the seat number assigned to him in business class. Everything looked correct. There was no double booking in the system. A small frown crossed his face. He wondered what really happened, but in the back of the plane the elderly man didn't know any of this. He didn't know that someone was checking the records. He didn't know that a young flight attendant had noticed the unfairness. He sat quietly, eyes closed, leaning back, lost in his thoughts. He remembered his son's proud face while handing him the ticket. "You deserve this, Papa," his son had said. "You worked your whole life. Now you should travel like a king." The man smiled faintly at the memory. He didn't feel like a king. Not anymore. But he still felt proud. Proud of his son. Proud of the love behind the gift. The seat didn't matter. The class didn't matter. What mattered to him was the care, the intention, the effort his son had made. Still, as the plane began to move, he couldn't stop the ache in his chest. Not from age, but from quiet humiliation. He had done nothing wrong, yet he had been treated like someone who didn't belong. And no one had stood up for him. Not yet, but something was about to change. Far in the front of the plane, the pilot was preparing to do something no one expected. Something that would not only return the old man to his rightful place, but would leave everyone on that flight with a memory they would never forget. The plane was in the air, cutting through the clouds. Most passengers had settled into their seats. In business class, everything looked perfect. The seats were wide and soft, the lights were dim, and the service was smooth. A flight attendant was serving drinks, fresh orange juice, wine, and coffee. Some passengers leaned back in their reclining seats, flipping through magazines or tapping on their tablets. The atmosphere was quiet and relaxed, just as one would expect in the premium section of a long international flight. But under that quiet surface, something else was present. Something unspoken. The elderly man who had been moved from his seat was still fresh in people's minds. No one was talking about it out loud, but many had seen it happen. Some had looked away on purpose, pretending not to notice. Others had watched carefully, trying to understand why a man with a valid business class ticket had been asked to move to economy. One man in a gray suit, who had been sitting 2 seats away from the elderly man, now sat with his eyes closed and arms crossed. He had noticed the whole thing but told himself it wasn't his concern. He had even thought for a moment that maybe the old man didn't really belong there. Maybe the airline had made a mistake. Maybe the man had gotten confused. "It's not my business," he had thought, and continued reading his newspaper. Now, as the flight continued, he couldn't stop replaying the image of the old man standing up, gently picking up his bag, and walking away without complaining. A middle-aged woman sitting near the window had also seen everything. She had whispered to her teenage daughter during the boarding. "Maybe he's lost," she had said. Her daughter had giggled softly, looking at the man's old shoes and wrinkled shirt. The woman had felt a little guilty afterward. Now she looked out the window, trying not to think about it. But inside, she felt something wasn't right. Across the aisle, a young man wearing headphones was scrolling through his phone. He had filmed a short clip of the incident, only a few seconds, but enough to show the old man being guided away by the flight attendant. He wasn't sure why he had recorded it. Maybe he thought it would go viral. Maybe he just felt it was worth capturing. Now he looked at the video again, unsure what to do with it. In the back of the plane, far away from these quiet reflections, the elderly man was sitting silently. His knees were hurting. The narrow seat pressed against his legs, and there was barely enough room for his cane. He had taken off his glasses and placed them in his pocket. He didn't want to see the faces of the people around him. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't sleeping. He was thinking. He thought about his life, about the years he had worked in a small government office, the sacrifices he had made for his children, and the happiness he had felt when his son gave him the business class ticket. That gift meant so much more than a comfortable seat. It was respect, it was love, it was honor. And all of that had been taken away in just a few minutes by strangers who didn't even ask him any questions. Near the back of the plane, a baby cried softly. The old man opened his eyes and looked around. No one was paying attention to him. Everyone was busy with their own problems. He leaned his head back and tried to rest, but his body was uncomfortable, and his heart was still heavy. Not far away, the young new flight attendant was having her own thoughts. She had joined the airline only 6 months ago. This was her 3rd international flight. She had been trained to follow rules, to respect senior crew, and to always stay professional. But what she had seen today didn't sit well with her. She had seen the elderly man's ticket. It clearly said business class. She had watched him being treated as if he didn't belong. She wanted to speak up, to ask why he was being moved, but she had been told by the senior flight attendant to let it go. Now she was serving drinks in economy class, walking past rows of tired passengers. As she passed the elderly man's row, she paused for a moment. He looked up at her, and she gave him a soft, sad smile. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes said it all. He nodded politely, not wanting to cause trouble. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the pilot was looking at the passenger list again. Something about the seating report didn't make sense. According to the records, the elderly man had been assigned a business class seat, 12A. The seat was not double booked. There was no system error. So why had he been moved? The pilot had flown hundreds of flights. He trusted his crew, but he also trusted his gut. And right now, his gut told him something wasn't right. He called the lead flight attendant into the cockpit and asked for an explanation. She seemed nervous. There was some confusion, she said quickly. The man didn't look like he was in the right seat. He didn't speak clearly. We thought maybe it was a mistake. The pilot narrowed his eyes. But the ticket was correct, he asked. She hesitated, then said, I didn't see it myself, but one of the crew said it looked wrong. The pilot didn't respond for a few seconds. Then he nodded and said, "I'd like to see him." Back in business class, the mood was beginning to change. Some passengers were starting to feel uneasy. It wasn't just the empty seat or the memory of the man being removed. It was something deeper. They had all silently agreed to look the other way, to pretend it didn't matter. But it did. A few of them whispered to each other, "Did you see his ticket?" Why didn't anyone say anything? That didn't feel right. The young man who had recorded the video was still watching it, again and again. He felt torn. Should he share it online? Should he complain to the airline? What would people say? Would they care? In economy class, the elderly man had finally closed his eyes again. He looked peaceful from the outside, but inside, his heart was heavy. He didn't want revenge. He didn't even want an apology. He just wanted dignity. That was all. And he thought about how many other people might have gone through similar things. Ignored, mistreated, judged only by their appearance. The young flight attendant walked past again. She stopped for a moment, then leaned down and said softly, "Sir, I just want you to know, I saw what happened. I'm really sorry." The old man opened his eyes, surprised. He looked at her kindly and nodded. "Thank you," he whispered. She smiled, then continued down the aisle, feeling a little better, but still helpless. A few minutes later, something unexpected happened. The curtain between business class and economy was pulled back. Passengers turned their heads to see what was going on. The pilot, tall, confident in uniform, was walking down the aisle. He wasn't smiling. He looked serious, focused. He walked past the premium rows, past the first economy seats, all the way to where the elderly man sat. People whispered. A few sat up straighter. The flight attendants looked at each other, confused. The pilot stopped next to the elderly man. He leaned down and said in a firm but kind voice, "Sir, I believe there's been a mistake. Your ticket says business class, and that's where you should be." The man looked up, surprised. He slowly took the ticket out of his pocket and handed it over. The pilot looked at it, nodded, then turned to the passengers nearby and said, "This gentleman has a valid business class ticket. He should never have been moved." The silence in that part of the plane was deep. People looked down. Some bit their lips. Others stared at the pilot in disbelief. The pilot then helped the old man to his feet. "Come with me, sir," he said, gently. He took the man's bag, walked slowly beside him, guiding him forward through the narrow aisle. As they passed the rows of passengers, many turned to watch. Some looked ashamed. A few smiled nervously. No one said a word. The young flight attendant stood still as they passed. The pilot gave her a quick look and a respectful nod. She understood. When they reached business class, the pilot stopped in front of seat 12A, the same seat the man had been removed from. "Please sit," he said. "This is your seat, and I apologize on behalf of the airline." The elderly man nodded slowly and sat down. He looked around the cabin. People were watching, but this time their expressions had changed. There was respect. There was silence. Some were even slightly smiling, as if they too felt relief. The pilot spoke to a flight attendant nearby, then returned to the cockpit. The business class cabin felt different now. Quieter, more thoughtful. A moment had passed that no one expected, but no one would forget. And somewhere in the back of the plane, a story had just started, one that would soon travel much farther than the plane itself. The elderly man slowly settled back into the wide, comfortable business class seat. His body was tired, but more than that, his heart felt strange. He hadn't expected to return to this seat, especially not like this. When he had been removed earlier, he hadn't complained. He had quietly followed the flight attendant without saying a word. But deep inside, something had hurt. A quiet pain that words couldn't describe. And now, after being brought back by the pilot himself, that pain was still there, though something else had started to replace it. Dignity. He looked around the cabin. The expressions on people's faces had changed. Earlier, when he was first sitting here, many had stared at him like he didn't belong. Some had even looked annoyed, confused, about why someone like him was sitting in business class. But now those same eyes avoided his gaze, or gave him a soft, polite smile. No one said anything out loud, but he could feel the change in the air. There was a different kind of silence now, not one of judgment, but of understanding. One of the senior flight attendants, the same woman who had asked him to leave the seat earlier, now approached him again. This time her face was different. Her proud expression had softened. She gently leaned down and asked if she could get him something to drink. The elderly man simply nodded and said, "Water, please." His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. Now. Not because it was louder, but because of everything that had happened. She brought him a glass of water on a small tray, placed it gently on his table, and said, "I'm truly sorry, sir." He didn't reply. He just gave a small nod. He wasn't someone who held anger. But her apology was late, and it didn't erase the moment when he had been treated as if he didn't deserve this seat. Meanwhile, the pilot had returned to the cockpit. But what he had done in those few minutes had left a strong impression on everyone. Many passengers were still talking about it in hushed tones. Some were surprised that a pilot would walk all the way to the back of the plane just for one passenger. Others felt a mix of guilt and respect. A few began questioning their own silence. Why had no one spoken up earlier? Why had everyone let it happen? In one of the front rows, a woman with short gray hair took out her notebook and began to write. She was a journalist, traveling for a story about culture and kindness in different countries. But now, she had witnessed something even more powerful, a real quiet act of injustice, and how a single person, the pilot, chose to correct it with simple, honest action. She had a feeling that this was the story she would write about instead. Further back in economy class, the young flight attendant who had felt bad about the whole situation was quietly smiling to herself. When she had seen the pilot escort the old man to business class, she had felt a sense of relief. For a moment she had felt powerless, like she couldn't do anything to help, but now she knew that even noticing the truth had mattered. Maybe her quiet discomfort had contributed in some way. Maybe doing the right thing always started with feeling that something was wrong. And yet, not everyone was at ease. The man in the suit, who had been sitting a few rows away from the elderly man, was now feeling deeply uncomfortable. He remembered how quickly he had judged the old man. He hadn't even asked or offered help. In fact, he had just assumed the man was in the wrong seat. Now he felt shame. That feeling stuck with him like a stain. He closed his eyes, but it wouldn't leave. The woman who had laughed with her daughter when the man was removed now felt foolish. Her daughter, too, had gone quiet. She had seen the pilot escort the old man back and realized that the laughter they shared earlier was not funny at all. It had been unkind. That lesson, though painful, would stay with the girl longer than the entire flight. But the most remarkable change had happened in the atmosphere of the plane itself. The business-class cabin had once been a space of silent luxury, separate, polite, and distant. Now it was a space where something human had happened, something real. An old man had been disrespected and then honored. And that small moment had reminded everyone that even at 30,000 feet in the air, basic kindness mattered more than ticket class or price. As the hours passed, the elderly man sat quietly. He drank his water slowly. A flight attendant brought him a warm blanket and asked if he needed anything else. He declined politely. He didn't ask for special service. He didn't demand extra food or favors. He just sat there, looking out the window, watching the sky change colors as the plane moved forward. The clouds below were soft and endless. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with gentle orange and pink shades. It was peaceful. For the first time in hours, he felt like he could breathe properly. He thought about his son again. He imagined him back home, probably still at work, maybe fixing someone's motorbike or adjusting an engine. He thought about how proud his son would be to know that his father had been treated with respect again. The old man made a mental note to tell him everything, not just about the ticket, but about what had happened after. He would describe the moment the pilot came and stood beside him, helped him stand, and walked with him like a friend. The flight continued. Dinner was served in business class. The elderly man received his meal with quiet gratitude. It wasn't just food, it was part of the respect he had been denied earlier. He ate slowly, carefully, not wasting a single bite. The other passengers, too, seemed more polite now. Some even smiled at him when they made eye contact. The tension had faded. In its place was a quiet sense of balance. A few hours later, the lights were dimmed, and passengers were given sleeping masks and pillows. The elderly man didn't sleep much. He closed his eyes for a while but kept waking up. His legs were sore, and his mind was still full of thoughts. But he didn't mind. He was used to discomfort. What mattered was that he had been given back his rightful place, not just in a seat, but in the eyes of those around him. In one of the back rows, the young man who had recorded the video was writing a post on social media. He had decided not to post the video itself, but to write about what he saw. He wrote about the old man, the flight attendant, the pilot, and the silence of the passengers. His words were honest and reflective. He ended the post with a simple message. Doing the right thing doesn't need permission. One person standing up can change everything. He didn't know how many people would read it, but it felt important to write. The pilot, back in the cockpit, was focused on the flight, but every now and then his mind returned to the old man. He thought about his own father, now retired, who had also worked hard all his life. The pilot knew that flying a plane came with responsibility, not just for safety, but also for dignity. Today, he had followed his instincts, and he was glad he had. As the plane began its descent, the passengers started to stir. Blankets were folded, trays were cleared, and seatbelts were fastened. The elderly man sat up straight, holding his cane. He looked calm, almost noble, like someone who had passed through something difficult and come out stronger. The flight. Attendants walked through the aisle, preparing for landing. When one passed him, she paused for a moment and said, "We hope you had a pleasant flight, sir." This time her voice was sincere. When the plane landed and taxied to the gate, the cabin lights came on. Passengers stood up, opened overhead bins, and collected their bags. As always, there was a bit of rush. People eager to get out. But something unusual happened. The passengers in business class didn't push past the elderly man. In fact, some stepped back and let him go first. One woman even helped him with his small bag. He smiled and said, "Thank you." He walked slowly down the aisle, cane in hand, with quiet dignity. As he passed through the curtain, a few people in economy class noticed him. One even recognized him from earlier and gave him a small nod of respect. He nodded back. The young flight attendant who had felt bad earlier stood near the exit, saying goodbye to passengers. When the old man reached her, she gave him a bright smile. "Take care, sir," she said. "Safe journey." He looked at her with kind eyes and replied, "Thank you, Beta." As he stepped off the plane and into the airport terminal, he felt lighter. The journey had started with a silent insult and ended with silent respect. He hadn't shouted or fought. He hadn't demanded anything. But the truth had spoken for itself, and someone had listened. Outside, his daughter waited, scanning the crowd. When she saw him, she ran forward and hugged him tightly. "Papa, you're here!" she cried. He smiled and patted her back. "Yes," he said. "And I have a story to tell you. A story about kindness at 30,000 feet. The moment the elderly man stepped off the plane and saw his daughter waiting for him, everything he had been holding inside began to melt. She ran toward him with open arms, her eyes filled with relief and love. The airport was busy. people, rushing past with luggage and families reuniting, but for a few moments the world around them disappeared. The daughter hugged her father tightly as if trying to make up for all the time he had spent alone on the journey. "Papa," she said, softly, "are you all right? You look tired." He gave her a small smile and replied, "I'm fine, Beta." The flight was long, but something strange happened. She looked at him, curious. "Strange? What do you mean?" He gently took her hand and said, "Let's sit, somewhere. I'll tell you everything." They found a small bench near the arrival gate. He sat down carefully, adjusting the cane in his hand. His daughter bought 2 cups of tea from a nearby stall and returned. As they sipped the warm tea, the elderly man began to tell her the story of what had happened on the flight. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, not out of hesitation, but because he wanted her to truly feel what he had gone through. He started from the beginning, how he had saved money to buy the business class ticket, not because he wanted luxury, but because he knew his body wouldn't handle the cramped economy seats. He told her about how excited he had been to travel in comfort for the first time. But when he boarded the plane and took his seat, something unexpected happened. He explained how a flight attendant had approached him and asked to see his ticket again, even though he had shown it once already. Then, in front of other passengers, she told him to move to the economy section. "I didn't argue," he told his daughter quietly. "I just stood up and followed her. But it felt like my heart dropped somewhere on that floor." His daughter clenched her fists. "But why? You had a business class ticket, right? That's so unfair." He nodded. "Yes, I did. But sometimes people only see your clothes or your face. They don't check the truth." He then told her about the young flight attendant who looked at him with sympathy and how he sat silently in an economy seat, humiliated. He shared how no one came to his defense. People just watched, some curious, some even smiling or whispering. He described how alone he felt in that moment, even though he was surrounded by people. Then he spoke of the turning point, the pilot. His daughter listened with wide eyes as her father told her how the pilot walked all the way to his seat in economy class, spoke to him with respect, and asked him to come back to business class. "He didn't raise his voice," the old man said. "He didn't scold anyone. He just looked me in the eye and treated me like a human being." His daughter couldn't hold back her tears. She wiped them quickly and said, "That pilot, he must have been an angel. People like him make the world better." The elderly man smiled. "Yes, he reminded me that not everyone forgets how to be kind." After finishing his story, he took a long sip of his tea and looked around the airport. People were moving about, busy with their lives. But he felt different now. The pain from the earlier humiliation was still there, but it had been covered by something stronger: dignity. His daughter held his hand and said, "I'm so proud of you, Papa. You didn't fight or shout, but you still got your respect back." They stood up and walked slowly toward the parking area, where a taxi was waiting. On the way home, his daughter kept looking at him, as if seeing him in a new light. To her, he had always been a hero, a hard-working father, a man of honesty and strength. But now, he was also someone who had quietly faced injustice and had been lifted back up not by anger, but by truth and the actions of a good man. When they reached home, his son was already there. He had taken off early from work to welcome his father. The moment he saw him, he touched his feet and said, "Papa, you're finally here." The elderly man laughed softly and hugged him. "Yes, Beta, I have reached safely, and I have a story for you too." That night, the family sat together at the dinner table. His daughter served him his favorite dish, and his son kept asking him to tell the story again. This time the old man added more details: how the passengers had reacted, how the flight attendants had changed their behavior, and how people had looked at him differently after the pilot walked him back. His son was silent for a long time after hearing everything. Then he said, "Papa, I'm sorry. I should have traveled with you. This shouldn't have happened to you." The elderly man placed a hand on his shoulder. Don't feel bad. You do so much for us. This journey taught me something too, that, even in a world full of people who judge, there will always be someone who stands up for what's right. The next few days passed quietly. The elderly man rested, met old friends, and enjoyed his time with family. But his story didn't stay within the walls of his home. A few days later, his son showed him a post online. It was written by a young man who had been on the same flight. The post talked about the old man, the way he had been wrongly removed, and how the pilot had done something remarkable by correcting that mistake. It ended with a powerful line. Respect should never depend on appearance. Today I saw what quiet dignity looks like. The post was spreading quickly. Thousands of people had shared it. Comments were pouring in, some angry, some emotional, and many expressing admiration for both the old man and the pilot. The elderly man stared at the screen, surprised. I didn't know anyone was watching, he said softly. His daughter smiled. Papa, people are always watching. But now they're learning too. Soon the story was picked up by a news channel. A reporter called and asked if she could come and interview the family. At first, the elderly man was hesitant. He didn't want fame, but his son convinced him. Let people hear your story, Papa. It's not just about you. It's about everyone who's ever been disrespected for no reason. So the reporter came. She was kind and respectful. She listened carefully as the old man shared his experience again. She also spoke to the daughter and the son, asking how they felt when they heard about what had happened. The interview was aired on TV and uploaded online. It reached more people than anyone expected. Strangers began sending messages. Some shared their own stories of being judged unfairly. Others thanked the elderly man for his calmness and the pilot for his courage. A few even said they had changed how they treated others because of this story. The airline itself released a statement. They said they were investigating the incident and had spoken to the crew involved. They promised to offer better training, to make sure passengers were treated with equal respect, no matter what they looked like. It was a small step, but an important one. One morning, the elderly man received a letter. It was handwritten, with neat, careful words. It was from the pilot. In the letter, he thanked the old man for his quiet strength and said that it had been an honor to walk him back to his rightful seat. He wrote, "Sir, your silence said more than 1,000 angry words could have. Thank you for reminding me why I chose this profession." The elderly man read the letter several times. He kept it safely in a drawer, wrapped in a cloth. It was more valuable to him than any gift. Days turned into weeks. But the memory of that flight didn't fade. It stayed alive in conversations, in news stories, and in the hearts of those who had heard it. The daughter started volunteering at a local organization that worked to promote kindness in public places. The son began greeting customers at his workshop with even more warmth and care. As for the elderly man, he went back to his simple life. Morning walks, evening prayers, and quiet cups of tea. But he had become something more now. Not a hero with fame, but a symbol of quiet resistance and simple dignity. And every time someone in his town spoke about respect, they mentioned him. Not because he shouted, but because he didn't. Not because he fought, but because he stood tall even when made to sit down. That one flight had changed many things. It reminded the world that justice doesn't always arrive with loud noise. Sometimes it walks quietly down the aisle of a plane, guided by the hands of a kind pilot, and returns someone to where they truly belong. The sun was shining brightly that morning, and the elderly man sat peacefully on a chair outside his house. A gentle breeze passed through the garden, brushing his white hair as birds chirped in the nearby trees. It had been several weeks since he returned from his journey. The journey that had changed not just his life, but touched the hearts of countless people he had never even met. Every day since then had brought something new, something unexpected. But deep inside, He remained the same calm, soft-spoken man who had quietly endured injustice and received his respect back in the most unexpected way. One of the biggest changes in his life was the attention. From being someone unknown in a crowd, he had become a figure of respect in his community. Wherever he went, whether it was the temple, the grocery store, or the local park, people recognized him. Some came forward and greeted him with folded hands, while others simply smiled at him from a distance with admiration in their eyes. Many would say, "Sir, we saw your story. You are a true inspiration." Some even brought their children to meet him, saying, "Beta, this is the man I told you about, the one who was treated unfairly but didn't lose his calm." He would simply nod with a smile and say, "Thank you, but I just stayed quiet and trusted the truth." His daughter noticed how people started treating him differently, even his neighbors. Earlier, most people knew him as a quiet old man who stayed indoors, spoke politely, and minded his own business. But now, he was someone they wanted to know more about. They invited him for tea, asked for advice, and even discussed social matters with him. He never sought attention, but it found him. And the beautiful part was, he didn't change. Fame had not entered his heart. He remained grounded. One day, the postman delivered a package addressed to him. Inside was a framed photo. It was taken during the flight. At the moment, the pilot walked beside him, guiding him back to his business class seat. The photo had been clicked by a fellow passenger and had gone viral. A well-known photographer had printed it, framed it, and sent it with a note that read, "A moment that defines quiet strength. May your dignity always inspire others." His son placed the frame on the wall in the living room, and anyone who visited the house would stop and look at it with a mix of pride and emotion. More surprises came their way. The airline, after receiving public pressure and support for the pilot, honored him with a special award. During the ceremony, the pilot made a short speech and mentioned the elderly man by name. He said, "There are moments in life when we must decide what is right, even when it is not easy. That day, I saw a man who was treated unfairly. I didn't do anything heroic. I just tried to do what should have been done from the beginning. But it is his patience and silence that taught me more than any training ever could." The airline also reached out to the elderly man personally. They offered him a lifetime upgrade to business class for any future flights he wished to take. They also issued a formal apology for what had happened. The flight attendant involved was sent for retraining, and the airline assured the public that discrimination of any kind would not be tolerated. When the family received the letter from the airline, the old man read it carefully and said, "I do not want revenge. I only want them to learn. If even one person is treated better tomorrow because of what happened to me, then it was all worth it." His response touched many. It was published in newspapers, quoted in online posts, and discussed in talk shows. People admired him not just for the way he handled the incident, but for the way he forgave. His humility made the story more powerful. One evening, he was invited to speak at a school where young students were learning about empathy and values. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking was not something he was used to, but his daughter encouraged him. "Papa, just tell your story like you told it to us. That's all." He went to the school, walked slowly to the stage, and stood before a hall filled with children and teachers. He didn't use big words. He simply described what had happened to him, how he felt, and how he chose not to shout or argue, but to stay silent and wait. He ended his speech with a line that stayed in everyone's mind. "Respect is not something you should have to earn by shouting. It is something that every person deserves, young or old, rich or poor." The children clapped for a long time, and many came forward after the event to shake his hand. Some even hugged him. One small boy said, "Uncle, I will never laugh at anyone who looks different again." That single sentence made the elderly man's eyes tear up. Slowly, the story began reaching international platforms. A journalist from a well-known global magazine flew down to interview him. The story was titled The Man Who Taught the World, about silent dignity. It spread across countries, translated into many languages. Strangers from around the world began sending letters, thanking him for showing the world that strength doesn't always look loud. Some letters included drawings made by children. Others had personal stories of how the elderly man had inspired them to treat people more kindly. One particularly touching letter came from a woman in a small town in Africa. She wrote, "I saw your story on the internet, and it reminded me of my father, who was once humiliated because of how he looked. Thank you for reminding the world that every human being has value." The old man read that letter several times and finally replied, in his simple English, "Thank you for sharing your heart. Your father's dignity is still alive through your words." Back home, life remained peaceful. He still enjoyed his morning walks, waving at children and shopkeepers. Every now and then, someone would stop him and say, "Sir, you are the reason I helped someone today." He would just smile. Then came another surprise. A small production company wanted to create a short film based on his story. They promised to keep it simple and respectful. After some discussions, he agreed. The film was released online and titled Seat of Respect. It showed the journey of a quiet man, wronged but not broken, who became a symbol of grace. The film reached millions. Comments poured in from people across the globe. One person wrote, "This film changed the way I treat my elders." Another wrote, "I work in an airline. I will never judge a passenger by how they look again." And another said, "He reminded me of my grandfather, quiet, gentle, and strong." It was not just a story anymore. It had become a movement. Months passed, and the fame slowly settled down. But the elderly man's story remained alive in people's hearts. He went back to his routine. He visited the park, fed the birds, and watched the sun set quietly. His family still treated him the same, with love and laughter. But they now admired him a little more, even if they didn't say it out loud. One day, as he sat alone under the shade of a tree, he closed his eyes and thought about everything that had happened. The pain of that day on the plane, the look people gave him, the way he was made to walk away from a seat he had paid for. It still hurt a little. But then he remembered the pilot, the walk back to his seat, the quiet respect. He remembered the letters, the children, the kind words from strangers. And most of all, he remembered the moment when his daughter ran to him at the airport and said, "Papa, you are home." A gentle smile formed on his face. He whispered to himself, "Sometimes God tests us not to see us break, but to show the world how we rise." And rise he did. Not with fists, not with anger, but with dignity. His story reminded people that kindness matters, that one act of standing up for someone, even silently, can light 1,000 hearts, and that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that don't shout. They simply stay strong. The elderly man didn't become rich. He didn't chase fame. But he left behind something far more valuable, a lesson that would live forever in the hearts of those who heard it. And so, the man who was once asked to leave his seat ended up sitting in the hearts of millions.